Okay, hi everyone.
Do
I'm
you
not
hear
sure.
that?
David's vaguely done a welcome to you all. So maybe it's best if we hand over to Mike Hart, and perhaps Mike, you better. Seems David didn't have a chance to say who you were or anything.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's a good chance for you to also introduce yourself. Let me just make you host.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. I started off in life studying and teaching statistics, and I moved into a number of industries and worked there. Then I came back to UCT in the information systems area, and I've now retired. I'm a retired academic, still keep my hand in a little bit, but in a way, family history has become more interesting as an area for me to research lately. So,
Okay.
Did everybody hear that? So, I'm a fairly recent member of the Cape Town Family History Society. Like many of you, I've been building up my family tree for a few years now. And I think that most of the members in my tree have had fairly conventional lives, but every now and then I've come across someone that has given me a surprise or even a real shock. And today I want to tell the story of how I built up information on three members of my family tree, leading in each case to some real surprises. First of all, my great-grandmother, Elizabeth Martha Hart, whose case certainly shocked me. Secondly, my wife Genevieve's great-great-great-grandfather, Captain George Cookman, master mariner, his interesting family, and his mysterious death. And finally, my great-great-grandfather's brother, Eli Hart, about whom I knew absolutely nothing, but whose colorful story unfolded with the great help of some genealogists from other countries. Continue. I'll just mention that all of the people I'm going to talk about are now dead, so we don't have any problems with the new Poppy Act. All right, first of all, Elizabeth Arthur Smith. On the right is a piece of my family tree from Ancestry.com. And my Hart ancestors go back many generations. My Hart ancestors go back many generations in Sussex. And Edwin Hart came out to the Cape with his brother Stephen in the 1840s. And in the 1970s, we lived in a house, in a cottage, straight across the road from St. John's Church, Wynberg. And I had no idea at that time that my great-great-grandfather, Edwin, was buried just down the road from us in the St. John Cemetery. One of his sons has a plaque in the Kruger Park celebrating his murder. I don't know if celebrating is the right word. I won't say any more about him because I wrote him up in the June 2020 Society newsletter. But another son, John George Hart, married Elizabeth Martha Smith, and my grandfather, Edwin Joseph Hart, was their only child. And I'll mainly focus on Elizabeth, but also say a little bit about her son. Now, I had very little information about Elizabeth Martha Smith. Here's a copy of her marriage in 1876. She was a spinster in Claremont, and it's from the St. John's Church Register. And there's also a copy from the St. John's Church Register of my grandfather's baptism. They were both living in Claremont then, and you can see that he was still a gardener. And sometimes witnesses on baptisms can be useful. In this case, John Smith would normally be Elizabeth's father, but he could also be a brother, and I still don't know. Apart from these, I had no other records for Elizabeth Martha Smith or Elizabeth Martha Hart, so I decided to see if I could find out anything more by making my first visit to the Cape Town archives. And first I searched at home on the NAAIRS database, and these records came up for John George Hart, her husband, and for Elizabeth Hart. But I didn't find anything for Elizabeth Martha Hart or Elizabeth Martha Smith. And the records for John George Hart didn't look so promising when I saw that he'd been declared insolvent in 1899. Now, I took out some of the big archives folders containing these records, and I had my first big shock, because the place where this Elizabeth Hart had died in 1892 was the leper ward on Robben Island. And what was particularly sad was that the word unknown was written next to so many things. Father and mother, unknown. Married, unknown. Surviving spouse, unknown. Names of children, unknown. Now, I would normally have totally dismissed this as not being the Elizabeth Martha Hart that I was looking for. But then I remembered seeing an extract from my grandfather's diary. He'd been told that his father had committed suicide and he'd returned from Oudtshoorn to Cape Town. And at the end of this sad extract, my grandfather had written about his mother. And then when I was quite little, she got this terrible disease. What it was, no one really knew. Her blood all turned to water, they say. She became horribly disfigured, and afterwards she was sent away to hospital. I can only remember her kissing me once. She loved me terribly, but she was afraid I might get the disease. I think my father feared it too. How careful poor mother was. She used to long to kiss me. Young as I was, I knew that, and she would not even allow me to wipe my face with her towel. And she was always gentle. So despite my huge shock at seeing this death notice, I realized that it must be hers. But I wondered how on earth she could have got leprosy. And back home again, I thought I should really try to visit Elizabeth's grave on Robben Island, if I could find it. So I Googled Robben Island leper graves and found some information and pictures. Then I added Elizabeth Hart to my Google search and had a totally unexpected hit, a 400-page medical book from 1893. And this book was all about the recent spread of leprosy around the world, partly caused by vaccination for smallpox, which was then rampant. And it turned out that Elizabeth Hart was one of two case studies discussed from South Africa. Her case had originally appeared in a German medical journal of 1889 and was covered in this 400-page book, in an 1891 book on leprosy by George Thin, and later elsewhere. Have a look at some of the quotations from this 400-page medical book by Tebb. Now, vaccination for smallpox became compulsory in 1882. And some of the comments here link it to the spread of leprosy, including in the Cape Times of the day. So here, a lot of people were thinking there was a link between the two. And here's some more detail on Elizabeth Hart's case. I've left out the very unpleasant detail that followed at the end of the first part, but with this information, it was clearly my grandmother. And this shows the great stigma that lepers and their families suffered, similar to those in the early years of HIV/AIDS. But also, if you weren't vaccinated for smallpox, you were fined, you couldn't get a public service job, and you couldn't be promoted if you already had a government job. And maybe vaccine passports are so new. Now, after all this, you might well think that I'm a strong anti-vaxxer, but I'm happy to say I've had my 2 jabs for the COVID virus, and I certainly recommend that everybody else does that too. Now, another book in 1891 by George Thin gave further shocking information on just how my great-grandmother had become a leper. it was common practice to either vaccinate with so-called lymph from a calf or human who already had smallpox. And it turns out that the good Dr. Silk from Weinberg had vaccinated Elizabeth with lymph from a person who already had leprosy and had. So the doctor gave her leprosy with his vaccination. Now, I don't think anybody should complain about the regulatory agencies who today carefully check vaccine material before they release it. That's people like SAPRA and the FDA. Unfortunately, apart from her death, I still know almost nothing about Elizabeth or her family before her marriage. No definite birth or baptism records. And it seems her grave was unmarked and maybe built over by the prison on Robben Island. In a very useful tour of the archives by Jaco, I learnt about the Colonial Office records, which seemed promising. I searched through many of their folders, as you can see here, but with only one sighting of Elizabeth Hart's name shortly before she died. And I think I looked fairly thoroughly, but I had the feeling that someone might have removed pages concerning her, perhaps to do with these books, but I will still continue searching. Now, I'd like to say just a little bit about Elizabeth's son, Edward Joseph Hart, my grandfather. As you can see, he didn't have a great start in life. Family was very poor. Father disappeared to the diamond fields or somewhere. His mother got leprosy, left school early just to make some money. His one bright area was church services at St. John's and other places. He really enjoyed those. And at a pretty early age, he was given the job as a postman. Now, what I'd like to do is just read a little episode from the notes on his life that he wrote in some exercise books not long before he died. And here he is at 11. I had by this time acquired a tremendous taste for reading, anything I could lay my hands on. And it seemed to me that the delivery of letters was rather a bore when there were so many delights in the books I borrowed. So I didn't deliver a number of letters, but placed them in one of the pillar boxes it was my duty to clear every day. And one day, to my horror, when I opened this box, that pile of letters that I had wickedly failed to deliver had disappeared. Suspicion had been aroused, and the postmaster had been there before me and removed the proofs of my guilt. So what did young Edwin do? I decided to run away. I had been paid that day. I changed my uniform for another suit, and I set off for the Cape Flats. I spent some miserable hours in the bushes in constant fear of seeing a policeman, and towards dusk made my way to Salt River. There I took a ticket to Beaufort West, and from there went on to Dar, where my funds were exhausted. I spent a night at prison and was taken by another officer back to Weinberg. And there I spent several days in prison, was fined and sentenced to receive some cuts with a cane. So he probably wouldn't have got a very good testimonial from the post office. But he managed to work pretty hard after that, and I've seen some of his testimonials from a number of places that he worked at. And in Oudtshoorn, he was involved in many areas, and his interest in reading later paid off as he moved from the grocery world into journalism, worked at many newspapers, became editor of a couple of them, and moved from political reporting to leader writing and editorial functions. After he retired, he was able to fulfill his other major interest in the church by being ordained as a priest. And also, despite his humble beginnings, he also made some good friends and acquaintances along the way, as these letters from Pierre Neuf, the artist, and General Smuts show. I'm going to turn to my wife's my wife Genevieve's great-great-great-grandfather, Captain George Cookman, Master Mariner, and the mystery of his death. And the Cookmans all came from East Riding in Yorkshire, from a sort of peninsula called Holderness, and later moved across to Hull, which is also called Kingston upon Hull. And my main focus will be on the son, George, of Francis Cookman, highlighted on the left here. They are my wife's direct ancestors. But before that, I look at George Cookman's uncle, George Cookman, highlighted on the right, and a few of his interesting descendants. And the Cookmans came from Althorn, which, like many little towns on the east coast of Yorkshire, largely fell into the sea during the 1800s. And we can see the baptism records of these two sons, Francis and George, from the Althorn Church. And fortunately, the oldest Cookman headstones, and here's one of them, were saved just before the whole churchyard vanished into the sea and transferred to an inland church graveyard. So we'll first look at our master mariner's uncle George, often called George Cookman Esquire, and he was born at their family farm before much of it disappeared into the sea, was apprenticed pretty young, and he soon became a strong follower of Methodism, and every Sunday for 30 years apparently used to travel on horseback to preach in surrounding towns. And 3 of the 5 children he had with his wife Mary died young, and she too died in 1830. But George built up successful businesses and properties. He became a justice of the peace and a councillor. And in the first 2 years of Queen Victoria's reign, he was mayor of Kingston upon Hull, and he died after a full life, aged 82. Now, his oldest remaining child, George Grimston Cookman, started off as a bit of a rebel, joined his father's business, and traveled to the USA for him. And there he seems to have had a bit of a conversion after seeing slavery at first hand, and he became determined to preach the gospel. And he married, had 5 children, and then moved from ministry to ministry in the USA, gaining an increasing reputation as a preacher. And after a period of ministering in Washington, D.C., and drawing huge congregations, he was elected chaplain to the United States Senate and Congress. And 2 years later, he took part in the inauguration of the new president, William Henry Harrison. And he had the honor of being asked to take the first message from the president's new administration across to the English Parliament and Queen Victoria. Now, in 1841, there was no Twitter, there was no email, there was no radio or telegraph. So the Reverend George Grimston Cookman would travel on the world's biggest ship, the SS President, from New York to Liverpool. And he seemed to have achieved great success. And here is the president, steamship president, set off on the 11th of March, 1841 for Liverpool. And here's a painting of what the ship looked like the next day. Unfortunately, the ship and all 136 on board, including George Grimston, were never seen again. What happened in a way was by adding an extra deck to the design of the previous largest ship, which was called the British Queen, it was 25% bigger, but it tended to roll, so they added lots of cargo. And unfortunately, that was the first big transatlantic disaster, well before the Titanic, and was never seen again. Now, I hadn't seen anybody else comparing these two events, but this struck me as a bad omen for the new president, who died of pneumonia only 3 weeks later, and he still holds the record for the shortest presidential reign. And much of George Grimston's life is covered in the first 3 chapters of a book about his son, Reverend Alfred Cookman, who became a famous preacher as well. So by now, George Cookman Esquire, the ex-mayor of Hull, had lost his wife and 4 of his 5 children. But Alfred, his grandson, the son of Reverend George Grimston, was making a big name for himself as a preacher and in his opposition to slavery. And the Cookman Institute was named after him, later merged to form the Bethune-Cookman University. And when I was Googling Alfred Cookman, I even found a link between him and Bruce Springsteen, performing in an avenue named after Alfred Cookman in Asbury Park. George Cookman Esquire's only surviving child of the five, Mary Ann, then decided to emigrate to South Africa with all her children in 1849. And her husband and young son, John, started the Natal Mercury newspaper. And after many years of service, her son, John, later Sir John Robinson, KCMG, was elected as the Natal colony's first prime minister. And here is a picture of him and a statue of him, which was outside the Durban City Hall. But whether it is still standing outside the eThekwini City Hall after recent events is anybody's guess. Now, I have digressed a bit, looking at George Cookman, the mayor, and his interesting descendants, but I'll go back to his elder brother, Francis Cookman, my wife's direct relative and the father of Captain George Cookman, the missing master mariner. And I hadn't found out much at this stage about Francis or his other kids. So I searched around the world and eventually came across this hard-to-read 1823 travel document between Quebec City and Montreal for an F. Cookman. And I thought, seems pretty unlikely, but could this be our guy? And when I searched further, I found that many people from the Hull area had emigrated to Quebec round about that time. And so I Googled more in the Quebec area, found a key website called The English Settlers of Lacal, Quebec. And after browsing in this, I found this. In 1825, Francis Cookman arrived in Lacal. Cookman was a highly esteemed Englishman, known as the father of Bogton, not a great place name, but anyway, he was from Althorn Parish, and he fostered a Sabbath school and managed a day school for over 17 years. So that was our man. And also I made contact then with another distant relative, Sue Whiteball, who had photographed the gravestone found earlier, and she put me onto another very useful website. And this guy, Mel Cookman, had meticulously gone through every single document he could find in the whole area that had the name Cookman in it and put together a very useful website. And I was now able to find out much more about Francis and the children who had emigrated to Canada, but I still want to know much more about his son, George, who hadn't emigrated, and what happened to him, where he died. Now, we knew he'd married Lucy Parkin, he'd had 5 children, and he seemed to have 2 jobs as both a mariner and a stationer and librarian. And looking in these directories, it was also quite tricky to distinguish him from his uncle, George Cookman, who also had various directory entries in Hull. When we looked at the 1841 census, there was Lucy Cookman and her 5 children, but no George. But another very useful thing we found was his master's certificate of service, dated 1853, which was probably why he wasn't in the census. He was away at sea. And this showed that he was still around, still alive in 1853, after 39 years of service in the British Merchant Navy. And we couldn't find any definite record, though, of his death date or place. Other family trees had just left it blank. Some of them had actually put in his uncle's death date and place. And Mel Cookman, who'd done such a great job on his website, made a mistake by reading that George's wife, Lucy, was a widow in 1851. But here's the 1851 census, and as you can see over here, that's definitely an M, not a W. And also we had other records, 1851, 1852, 1854, which showed he was still around then, certainly hadn't died before 1850. Now, there was a list of documents on the English Settlers of Lacal website, and one of them said it was a portrait of Captain George Cookman. So I contacted the website manager. He kindly sent me an image of this and some other items, and it was great to have an actual portrait of Captain George Cookman. And after more searching, I finally came across a burial notice for a George Cookman in 1855 in Quebec. It was difficult to read, but I think my transcript here is correct. Burial notice at Grosse-Île, Quebec. George Cookman, passenger on board the bark Chance, aged 56 years, died on the 19th and was buried on the 20th day of July in the year of our Lord, 1855. But how would we know that this is our George Cookman? And two things were that this death was in 1855, and the last records we had were 1851, 52, 53, and 54, and also his age of 56 on the record matched what his age would have been according to his master's certificate of service. And then we found a register for deceased UK seamen and searched for a ship called Chance, and up came this matching record for a George Cookman. And I'll just comment on what it said. This UK register showed that this George Cookman was a deceased seaman. He died of consumption on the ship Chance in Quebec on that date. And the ship had come from the port of Goole upstream from Hull, and the master of the ship was Illingworth. Now, the burial notice said he was a passenger, but this register clearly showed that he had been a seaman. So I wondered whether George Cookman, after he'd retired in 1853, could have said, let's go and see my relatives in Quebec, and had joined this ship as a passenger. And then something made me Google further, and I found a website of all ships that had come from Goole. And when I searched for Chance, I found a short history of this ship, this bark Chance. And you can see the start of the record at the bottom, but strangely, by far the biggest part of the record of its history was taken up by a message sent from the bark on the very day that George Cookman had died. And I'll read it. Quebec, 19th of July, 1855, his death date. We, the undersigned, on behalf of the passengers by the bark Chance of Goole, desire to express our unqualified satisfaction and approval of the accommodation and provisions of the vessel, with our best wishes for her success. Our voyage has been pleasant and prosperous, which may be attributed, etc., to the caution, skill, and vigilance of our highly esteemed and worthy captain. To our friends leaving the old country for America, we should most certainly recommend their coming, if possible, with our worthy friend Captain Henry C. Illingworth of the good bark Chance. Signed by some crew and 90 steerage passengers. Now, why would there be this effusive praise for the accommodation and provisions and the ship's captain on this particular day, the exact day of George's death? And why would all the passengers, as well as the crew, sign it, where the passengers may be forced to sign it to go further? So I thought, well, let me see, where's this place that he died? Grosse-Île, Quebec. And I found it was an island in the St. Lawrence River, where all travelers from outside Canada would have to go. And then I read more about its unhappy history. And I'll read just part of these extracts. It was turned into a quarantine station to prevent the spread of cholera. It was used to quarantine Irish people fleeing the Great Hunger, the potato famine, between 1845 and 1849. Over 3,000 Irish people died on the island. Over 5,000 are buried in the cemetery there. Most who died on the island were infected with typhus. And Grosse-Île is the largest burial ground for refugees of the Great Potato Famine outside Ireland. And this doctor removed 2,200 corpses from the ships and buried at least 5,400 dead in the course of 1847. So 1847 was a particularly horrific year for diseases and deaths on this island, and George's death there was just 8 years later. And maybe the reason for them sending out this message as soon as an ex-ship's captain had died on the island was if the message got out, they were trying desperately to stop it ruining their future business. That's my supposition, but we never know. Lastly, I found there was a WikiTree project aimed at expanding knowledge of the people who'd been buried on Gross Eel. So I gave the project leader my information about George Cookman, happy to get it. And she later managed to find a newspaper clipping from East Yorkshire of George's death notice, which totally verified things. And it's just surprising that nobody, including me, had found that before. But that really explained everything clearly. We did have the right guy. Maybe I can one day find out more about the actual voyages that George made as a master mariner in the UK National Archives, which these things are housed. Well, ladies and gents, I've covered 2 of the 3 people. I've got one more. Shall I continue?
Yes, carry on.
Okay, right, thank you. Lastly, I'm going to talk about my great-great-grandfather's brother, Eli Hart. And it illustrates how helpful other genealogists and enthusiasts can be. Now, I knew of Eli's existence from the 1841 UK census in Newark, which is a small town in East Sussex, as you can see on the map. He was a slightly younger brother of my great-great-grandfather, Edwin Hart, who's buried here in St. John's Cemetery. And from another family tree in gmail.com, I found all the baptism records for Eli and his siblings, and it turned out that Eli had been baptized 2 years after his birth, together with his younger brother Abram. But at the time, I couldn't find him in the UK 1851 census, and I stopped looking for him. And in 2017, I visited St. Mary's Church in Newark in Sussex and found the gravestones of Eli and Edwin's parents, Sarah and Thomas Hart, and of his grandparents. And then I saw a general message to ancestry members from Melanie Smith, who turned out to be a 4th cousin of mine, and who was researching Eli's father, Thomas Hart. And later she turned her attention to Eli Hart and found out quite a bit. And I also started to look further into him. And then Melanie also contacted members of Roots Chat and asked them if they could help with any information about Eli from the USA. Now, I've never had anything to do with Roots Chat, but soon the messages were coming in thick and fast from them. Now, these were the people who responded, and I must say they look pretty impressive. I think it puts 5-star generals in the shade. I mean, just look at all those posts these guys have done. Anyway, between them and Melanie, they quickly put a big chunk of the story together, and I've since added to it. And as Melanie says at the bottom, there were many twists and turns. Now, I'm not going to cover the pieces of information in the exact order that everybody found them, but I'll put it more in order of when the events happened. And I had found the earliest record after the 1841 census, which showed that an Eli Hart had married a Jane Court Stanway in London in 1853. And it did look like our Eli, because he and his father were both bricklayers. It later turned out that his wife was 20 years older than him, but they were living at the same address. Anyway, the next sighting was an Eli Hart in the 1860 census for New York. And he was a mason, but like a bricklayer, with a different woman or wife called Mary, and 2 children, Emily and Ellen. And then next we found a shipping record for an Eli Hart, a plasterer, perhaps one up on a bricklayer, who'd been in the USA for 15 years already, and he was the right age, with Mary and these 2 children again, with ages that maybe weren't quite right. And they were traveling back to the USA from London. But when I looked for 1870 census records in either UK or USA, I couldn't find them. Now, we remember we've had a couple of wives so far. We jump to 1880, and here's Eli Hart in two different census records in Washington, D.C. as a plasterer. The first one had his correct age and an apparent wife called Annie. But the second one, he's gone from being 52 to being 45, and he's with wife Anne, and suddenly there's a 4-year-old daughter called Bertha. Now, to make things more interesting, we found another marriage record for an Eli Hart in Washington, D.C. to a Mrs. Lucy M. Bryant in 1886. So just what was going on? Did we have a bigamist or even a trigamist on our hands? Or were these maybe different Eli Harts? Most of the 1890 UK census records were destroyed in a fire, but we've got one from 1900. And here Eli is widowed, presumably from all these wives, and Bertha, who was down as his daughter in 1880, is now his married granddaughter with a son. And we can also see that Eli became a naturalized US citizen back in 1863. Now, what was also happening in the United States in 1863? Can you think? Yes, it was the United States Civil War. And Eli was drafted on the 30th of June, 1863 in New York. And as with Vietnam, the draft was not popular, caused major protests just 2 weeks after he was drafted. And these protests escalated into riots for quite different reasons. Race riots with looting, arson, lynching, over 100 deaths. And it was said that law and order couldn't easily stop what was going on. Does that maybe sound a little familiar? The next thing we found was a freedman's bank deposit card for Eli and his wife, which was interesting for a number of reasons. Freedman's, as the name suggests, was set up by Abraham Lincoln for freed slaves to save their money. So it was a bit surprising that Eli was depositing there. But secondly, he made his deposit on 17th of September, 1873. And that was exactly one day before a major United States bank went bankrupt and started the so-called Panic of 1873, which went on for a few years and closed the New York Stock Exchange for 10 days. So was Eli very prescient, perhaps withdrawing his money from the bad bank and putting it in this other one? Don't know. But thirdly, the important point here is that Eli's wife's name on this card was Mary Ann Hart, which suggests that the Mary from the 1860 census and the 1871 travel document and the Anne and Annie of the 1880 census records were one and the same person, which would leave him with 3, not 4 wives. I then did a check on Eli's first 1853 wife, Jane Court Stanway, and saw that in the 1861 census, she was shown as a married house servant. So he probably didn't marry her for her money. Then in 1871, as a widowed monthly nurse, so she decided she got widowed then, living with her brother. But as she died in 1879, and Eli married Mrs. Lucy Bryant in 1886, he wasn't a bigamist with those 2 wives, but there was still wife Mary Ann. Now, breaking news in Washington, D.C.'s Alexandria Gazette. And here I must mention that much of what the Root Chat gurus found came from local newspapers through a useful free website from the Library of Congress called Chronicling America. And otherwise, one usually has to pay to subscribe to something like newspapers.com. And this was a long article, and I've just cut out chunks of it, and there's just time to focus on the areas highlighted in red. And first, we learn that Eli had a badass son-in-law called James Clark, who shot him at close range 5 times. And then, further down or across, Hart's wife, which one, seemed to be dying, and Eli had also recently taken his daughter, which one, we don't know, to hospital. And this Eli Hart had been a bricklayer, but had also started a confectionery business with this unknown daughter. And finally, at the bottom, it looked as though Eli was dying. But luckily, 3 weeks later, here was Eli able to testify in court against the shooter James Clark. And strangely, James Clark was only sentenced to 6 years in prison 5 years after the event. And then he found 2 clues as to who this daughter was. First of all, there was a record of a son born to the shooter, James Clark, and to Eleanor Hart. And then secondly, a whole 9 years after the shooting, Eleanor Clark wanted a divorce from the shooter, James Clark. So it was clear that the daughter that we weren't sure of was Eleanor Clark, who was probably the one that was previously... Not very much more. All right. Now, other information we found on Eli comes from another useful source that you can often find is directories. So he'd been a bricklayer. Later on, he became a confectioner with his daughter, Eleanor, just before he got married to this 4th wife, Lucy. And in the year he was shot, Lucy was also listed in the directory as a dressmaker. But there was no sign of Lucy after 1887, so we think that perhaps she did die then, but we don't know. And the next thing we saw was that Eli had died in 1904, and from findagrave.com, there was a burial record for him at the Glenwood Cemetery in Washington, D.C. And that was a useful source of information too, because we could see from the Glenwood Cemetery records, and notice that Hart is spelled H-E-A-R-T there, so you don't always pick these things up, but he died of nephritis. And then in looking at the Glenwood Cemetery records, we found that his wife, Mary Ann Hart, had in fact died back in 1883, before Eli married Lucy M. Bryant. And this Glenwood Cemetery produced something particularly useful, and that was this card, which showed us that in 1883, when Mary Ann died, Eli must have bought lot 117 in the cemetery. And then later, as other people died, there's his daughter Eleanor's second husband, Frank Clark. Now, this is confirmed later that Frank Clark was her second husband, and we don't know whether he was related to her shooter first husband, James Clark. But then there was also the burial of little Jeff Clark, who was the son of Eleanor with that shooter husband. And then also Bertha Smith, who had been Eli's daughter and then became his granddaughter. Now we think that Bertha Smith must have been Eleanor's daughter out of wedlock when she was about 17 with no known father, and Eli and Mary Ann must have looked after young Bertha as if she was their child. And then finally, we've got William T. Bryant, who was the stepson for Eli when he married Mrs. Lucy Bryant, but there's no sign of Lucy Bryant over here. Now, what about Eleanor Hart Clark, Eli's daughter? Well, we found out from a couple of censuses that she was managing certain stores, and then another newspaper article told us how she died. Not very pleasantly. And also her death notice on the right confirms that Frank Clark was her second husband. And then at the bottom, we see that she, in fact, was also buried with her other relatives, Eli and her mother, and so on. And this is the second last slide, and this is how the family tree was built up after initially only knowing when Eli Hart was born, thanks to all the help from these other people as well. We still don't know where Mary Ann came from and whether she actually married Eli. So if she did marry Eli, Eli was a bigamist with his wife, Jane. We also don't know when Lucy Bryant Hart died and where she's buried. And we don't know what happened to the young Emily Hart, Eleanor's sister. Just a few final points I'd like to make, and this is the last slide. Remember, when you're searching for people, that names can often be spelled in many different ways. And just in this case, we had Eleanor without the A, Elnora, and then Eli was spelled in 3 different ways. And your dates of birth, your ages can also vary quite a bit for different reasons. But in this case, it looks as though Eli deliberately gave a younger age in 1880 when he was pretending to be the father of Bertha as opposed to her grandfather. Now, it isn't always the case, but in this particular one, so many clues came from newspapers. So if you're able to get free options for looking at newspapers, it can be very worthwhile. In terms of linking people together, which is often important, especially if they have different surnames, here, typically you find that marriages and censuses and baptisms help there. But in this case, that Freedman's Bank card and the cemetery card were very useful at putting all these different surnames together. And then finally, you can often get really good help by corresponding with other people in these different genealogical areas. And certainly the Roots Chat people and Melanie help tremendously here. And finally, please note that I think that most of my ancestors had fairly conventional lives. Okay, and that's it. So let me try to reveal myself again. I'll do a stop share. Have I gone silent?
No, you haven't gone. You haven't gone silent. You. Thank you very much for a very nice presentation. It was greatly appreciated. I'm sorry we had all those hassles in between.
Okay. Now I don't know if, in fact, I can't even see myself on the screen now. But I don't know if I'll just. I've got a list of participants here. Let me knock that. And I'm going to just, okay. I can't see myself, but does anybody have any questions? I should, no, I don't know if I can unmute everybody.
Oh, well, I don't know if you can hear me. I'm Anne.
Yes, Anne, I can.
Okay, I'm interested because I also have bigamy in my family history.
Right.
And it seems that people are often shocked to hear that you have this awful smear in your history. Because when I was living in England, I mentioned to somebody I worked with that my grandfather had been a bigamist. And when I told her that and told her some of the story, she said, oh, well, of course, I've got nothing like that in my family. But I said, well, maybe you need to do some more research because it was quite common. It was very difficult to get divorced and very expensive and a terrible slur on your character. But yes,
Right.
I need to write up this story someday, but somehow I feel a little bit disloyal to my grandfather by revealing his terrible secret. And the other thing is, I suspect he also had yet another family. And
Yes.
my grandmother, he had abandoned in Durban with 5 children. and including my mother, who was the only girl. They were out of 5 children. And later, when he married bigamously, he mentioned to his second family, the one son, that he wished he had a daughter. You know, are they actually sociopaths, or do they forget that family, or how does it happen?
Yes, good question.
Anyway, interesting. Thank you very much.
It was a very interesting talk. Thank you, Mike. I think it just makes your family.
Any further?
Yes.
You say something, David?
No, carry on, Anne. I just wanted to ask if anybody wanted to ask him further questions.
Does it actually become an obsession to find all this out? Do you like follow up one clue and lie in bed at night and wonder what you can find next?
I don't think I lie in bed at night, but it's a bit like detective work, and you get sort of fascinated by certain things and intrigued by certain things. I think some people are just pretty boring, but there's some of them that make you want to take things a bit further if you can. That's how it's been with me. My wife, who's been listening, may disagree, but it can be quite addictive, I think. Yes. Pleasure.
Okay, bye everyone.
Are we all done? Well, thank you very much for your attendance,
Thank you.
and we'll see you again soon.
Okay.
Bye.
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 Bye.